The fog rolled through London streets on that bitter January morning in 1857, wrapping Westminster Abbey in a shroud of grey that seemed to muffle even the tolling of the great bells. Inside the ancient sanctuary, Sister Catherine Ashford knelt in prayer before the altar, her hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles had turned white as bone. To any observer, she appeared to be nothing more than a devout nun lost in contemplation, her black habit blending into the shadows of the chapel where she had come to seek solace. But beneath her serene exterior, Sister Catherine's mind raced with a terrible burden that had haunted her for 20 years, a secret so dark and devastating that it threatened to shake the very foundations of the British Empire. She was not who she appeared to be, born Catherine Blackwell in 1817. She had been the daughter of a prominent London merchant who had lost everything in a financial scandal that had destroyed her family when she was just 15 years old. Her father, desperate and disgraced, had taken his own life, leaving Catherine and her mother to face a world that showed no mercy to fallen women. Within a year, her mother had succumbed to fever, and Catherine had found herself utterly alone in a city that devoured the weak and vulnerable. It was in those desperate days that she had first encountered the man who would change the course of her life forever, a charismatic revolutionary who called himself Marcus Thornwell and spoke of justice for the oppressed and vengeance against the corrupt nobility who exploited the poor. He had seen something in the angry, grieving young woman, a hunger for purpose, a willingness to sacrifice everything for a cause that promised meaning in a world that seemed devoid of it. The lords who sit in Parliament grow fat on the suffering of ordinary people. Marcus had told her in the candle-lit basement of a printer's shop where revolutionaries gathered to plot their desperate schemes. They pass laws that starve children, that force honest men into debtors' prisons, that allow factory owners to work people to death for pennies. Someone must make them answer for their crimes. Catherine, barely 16 and burning with rage at the injustices that had destroyed her family, had believed every word. She had joined Marcus's inner circle, a secret organization that called itself the People's Justice Committee, and for 3 years she had participated in their increasingly radical activities, distributing seditious pamphlets, gathering intelligence on government officials, and eventually participating in acts that she had never imagined herself capable of committing. Now, 20 years later, kneeling in Westminster Abbey as Sister Catherine, she could still see the faces of the 9 men who had died because of her actions. Their names were seared into her memory like brands: Lord Pemberton, Lord Hastings, Lord Blackthorne, Lord Wessex, Lord Huntington, Lord Ashbury, Lord Ravenswood, Lord Stirling, and Lord Fitzgerald. All of them members of Parliament, all of them condemned by Marcus's revolutionary tribunal as enemies of the people, and all of them executed in secret over the course of 18 terrible months between 1837 and 1838. The official records told a different story, of course. Lord Pemberton had supposedly died of a heart seizure. Lord Hastings had perished in a hunting accident. Lord Blackthorne had been found at the bottom of his estate's grand staircase with a broken neck. One by one, the 9 lords had met deaths that appeared unfortunate but natural, their passing noted with appropriate sorrow by their peers, who suspected nothing of the carefully orchestrated conspiracy that had claimed their lives. But Catherine knew the truth. She had helped plan each operation with meticulous care, gathering information about the Lord's routines and vulnerabilities. She had used her youth and apparent innocence to gain access to households where she gathered intelligence that Marcus had used to orchestrate what he called executions. But what Catherine now recognized as murders. The 9th and final death, Lord Fitzgerald, who had been found drowned in the Thames, had broken something inside her. She had watched from the shadows as his wife had collapsed at the news, as his 3 young children had wept at the funeral, and she had finally understood the true weight of what she had done. These men, whatever their political positions or moral failings, had been human beings with families who loved them, and lives that extended far beyond their votes in Parliament. Horrified by her own actions and terrified of Marcus's increasing radicalism, Catherine had fled London in the dead of night. She had made her way to a convent in Yorkshire, far from the city where she had committed such terrible acts, and had begged the Mother Superior to grant her sanctuary. The wise old nun had looked into Catherine's haunted eyes and, without asking questions she perhaps didn't want answered, had welcomed her into the order. For 20 years, Catherine had lived as Sister Catherine, dedicating herself to a life of prayer, contemplation and service to the poor. She had worked in the convent's hospital, tending to the sick and dying with a gentleness born of desperate penitence. She had fasted and prayed and performed every act of contrition she could imagine, trying to atone for sins that seemed beyond forgiveness. But the past, she had learned, never truly releases its grip. 3 weeks ago, a letter had arrived at the convent addressed to Catherine Blackwell, a name she hadn't heard spoken aloud in 2 decades. The Mother Superior had brought it to her with worried eyes, and Catherine's hands had trembled as she broke the seal. Inside, in handwriting, she recognized instantly, were words that had shattered the fragile peace she had built. "My dearest Catherine, I know where you are. I know what you've become. And I know that you alone hold the evidence that could bring down everyone involved in our glorious work all those years ago. The game is not over, my dear. In fact, it's only just beginning. Meet me at the old place, or I'll be forced to reveal to the world what the pious Sister Catherine really is. You have 1 week. The letter was unsigned, but it didn't need to be." Marcus Thornwell had found her at last. Now, as she knelt in Westminster Abbey, the very heart of the establishment she had once sought to destroy, Catherine faced an impossible choice. Marcus wanted her to remain silent, to protect him, and whatever new schemes he had devised. But Catherine, transformed by 20 years of contemplation and service, had come to understand that true justice required something far different than the vengeful violence she had once embraced. The weight of 9 deaths pressed upon her soul, and she knew that she could carry that burden no longer. She had come to Westminster Abbey not just to pray, but to make a decision that would change everything, to confess her terrible crimes and face whatever punishment the law demanded, even if it meant her own death. As she rose from her knees and walked toward the office where she knew she would find Bishop Thornton, a man known for his integrity and his connections to the highest levels of government, Catherine felt something she hadn't experienced in 20 years. The first stirrings of genuine peace. The truth, however terrible, was about to be revealed. And though she trembled at what awaited her, she knew that this was the only path to the redemption she had sought for so long. Behind her, unnoticed in the shadows of the Abbey, a figure watched her progress with cold, calculating eyes. Marcus Thornwell had not survived 2 decades as a revolutionary by trusting others to keep his secrets. He had come to ensure that Catherine made the right choice, or to ensure that she would never speak at all. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose secrets buried for 20 years and force both the Church and the ground to confront uncomfortable truths about justice, vengeance, and the price of redemption in a society built on foundations far more fragile than anyone wanted to admit. Bishop Thornton's office was a sanctuary of warm mahogany and leather-bound books, insulated from the cold January morning by thick carpets and a fire crackling cheerfully in the marble hearth. The bishop himself was a man of perhaps 60 years, with kind eyes that had seen much of human nature's darkness, yet somehow retained their capacity for compassion. "Sister Catherine," he said gently, gesturing to a chair across from his massive desk, "Mother Superior sent word that you wished to speak with me on a matter of grave importance. Please sit down. You look as though you've been carrying the weight of the world." Catherine settled into the offered chair, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. For a long moment, she couldn't find the words to begin. How did one confess to crimes so monstrous that they could shake the very government of England? How did one explain becoming a murderer in the name of justice? Your Grace, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper, what I am about to tell you will shock you beyond measure. I ask only that you hear me out completely before you summon the authorities, because the full story is far more complex than it may initially appear. The bishop's expression grew serious, but he nodded encouragingly. I'm a servant of God first and the crown second, sister. Whatever you need to confess, know that I will listen with the compassion that our faith demands. And so Catherine began to speak. She told him everything, about her family's fall from grace, her father's suicide, her mother's death. She spoke of Marcus Thornwell and the People's Justice Committee, of the anger and desperation that had driven her to join their cause. She described how she had been seduced by revolutionary rhetoric that painted the aristocracy as villains, deserving of death rather than human beings deserving. Of mercy and understanding, the bishop listened without interruption. As she recounted the deaths of the 9 lords, her voice growing steadier as she spoke the truth aloud for the first time in 20 years. She explained how each death had been carefully planned and executed to appear accidental, how the committee had celebrated each success as a victory for the oppressed masses. We truly believed we were serving justice, she said, tears streaming down her face. We convinced ourselves that these men were monsters who deserved to die for their votes on laws that cause suffering. But we were wrong, Your Grace, so terribly, murderously wrong. She described her flight to the convent, her 20 years of penance, and finally, the letter from Marcus that had brought her to this moment of reckoning. He wants my silence, she concluded, her voice stronger now despite her tears. But I cannot give it to him. These crimes have haunted me every day for 20 years. The families of those men deserve to know the truth about what happened to their loved ones. And I deserve whatever punishment the law demands for my terrible actions. When she finished speaking, the silence in the office was absolute. Bishop Thornton sat perfectly still, his face pale with shock as he processed everything he had just heard. Finally, he rose from his chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the fog-shrouded streets of London. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? He said quietly. If I report this to the authorities, it will cause a scandal unlike anything this nation has seen in a century. 9 members of Parliament murdered in a conspiracy that went undetected for 20 years. The public trust in our institutions will be shattered. I understand, Catherine replied. But the alternative is to allow murderers to go unpunished and victims' families to remain in ignorance of the truth. Surely that is a worse crime than any scandal. The bishop turned back to face her, and she saw something in his expression that made her breath catch, not condemnation, but a terrible sadness mixed with what might have been respect. You mentioned evidence, he said carefully. In his letter, this Marcus Thornwell suggested you possess evidence that could implicate others in the conspiracy. What evidence? Catherine reached into her habit and withdrew a small leather-bound journal that she had kept hidden for 20 years. She placed it on the bishop's desk with shaking hands. Everything is in here, she said. Names, dates, methods. I kept detailed records because Marcus insisted we document our work for what he called the history books that would celebrate our revolution. I've carried this journal with me every day for 20 years, unable to destroy it but terrified of what would happen if it were discovered. The bishop picked up the journal and leafed through it, his expression growing darker with each page. Catherine saw him pause at certain passages, his jaw tightening as he read details of murders disguised as accidents and the cold calculations that had condemned 9 men to death. There are at least 20 other names in here, he said finally, people who participated in the planning or execution of these crimes. Some of them are still alive, living respectable lives with no one suspecting their past. Yes, Catherine confirmed. Marcus built a network of revolutionaries throughout London's society, servants who gathered information, professionals who provided expertise, even a doctor who helped stage some of the death scenes to ensure they appeared natural. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Before the bishop could respond, the door swung open to reveal a tall man in an elegant coat who surveyed the scene with eyes as cold as winter ice. "I'm afraid I must interrupt this touching confession," Marcus Thornwell said, stepping into the office with a pistol in his hand. "Hello, Catherine. I had hoped you would come to your senses, but I see I gave you too much credit." The bishop moved protectively in front of Catherine, his voice carrying unexpected steel for a man of the cloth. "Put that weapon away immediately," he commanded. "This is a house of God, and I will not allow you to compound your crimes with violence in this sacred place." Marcus laughed, a sound devoid of warmth or humanity. "Your Grace, you have no idea what you've stumbled into. That journal Catherine so helpfully provided contains evidence that reaches far beyond a few murdered lords. There are names in there of people who now hold positions of great power, people who would pay any price to keep their involvement in our youthful indiscretions secret." "Is that what you call murder now?" Catherine said, finding her voice despite her terror. "Youthful indiscretion? I call it the price of revolution," Marcus replied coldly. "Those 9 lords were blocking legislation that would have improved the lives of thousands. Their deaths served a greater purpose. Their deaths served your ambition," Catherine shot back, 20 years of repressed anger finally finding its voice. "You used me and the others, convincing us we were fighting for justice when really you were simply eliminating obstacles to your own rise to power." The bishop's eyes narrowed with sudden understanding. "You're Marcus Thornwell," he said slowly. "But you're also someone else now, aren't you? Someone with a new identity, someone who has benefited from those convenient deaths." Marcus's smile was chilling in its complete absence of remorse. "Very perceptive. Your Grace, let's just say that certain vacant parliamentary seats created opportunities for ambitious young men to advance their careers. But those details are irrelevant now. What matters is that journal, and ensuring it never sees the light of day." He raised the pistol, pointing it directly at Catherine's heart. "I'm truly sorry." "My dear," he said without a trace of genuine emotion, "you were always my favorite. But I can't allow 20 years of careful planning to be destroyed by your sudden attack of conscience. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and when we reach that milestone, we'll have an incredible surprise waiting for all our loyal viewers. Trust us, you won't want to miss what we have planned." The crack of the pistol shot echoed through Westminster Abbey like a thunderclap, shattering the sacred silence and bringing monks and clergy running from every direction. But the bullet did not find its intended target. At the last possible moment, Bishop Thornton had thrown himself in front of Catherine, taking the shot meant for her. He collapsed to the floor with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder as blood seeped between his fingers. Marcus cursed and moved to fire again. But the office door burst open to reveal 2 men in the dark coats of Scotland Yard detectives, their own weapons drawn and aimed directly at the revolutionary. "Drop the weapon immediately," commanded the taller of the 2 men, his voice carrying absolute authority. "You are surrounded, Mr. Thornwell, or should I say, Lord Ashford." Marcus's face went white with shock. "How did you—" "We've known about your dual identity for 3 months, the detective replied, moving forward to disarm the stunned man. "Ever since an anonymous letter arrived at the yard, suggesting we investigate certain suspicious deaths among the peerage 20 years ago. We've been watching both you and Sister Catherine, waiting to see which of you would make the first move." Catherine, kneeling beside the wounded bishop and pressing her veil against his bleeding shoulder, looked up in confusion. "I don't understand," she said. "I only decided to confess this morning. How could you have known 3 months ago?" The second detective, a shorter man with kind eyes that reminded her of her late father, stepped forward with something that might have been sympathy in his expression. "Because you weren't the only one haunted by guilt, sister," he said gently. "Dr. Edmund Price, who helped stage several of the death scenes, came to us before he died of consumption. He wanted to clear his conscience and provided us with enough information to begin a very quiet investigation." He pulled out a familiar-looking journal, almost identical to the one Catherine had just placed on the bishop's desk. Dr. Price kept his own records, the detective explained, but his evidence was incomplete. He didn't know all the participants or have proof of Marcus Thornwell's current identity. We needed someone else from the inner circle to come forward and provide the missing pieces. We've been waiting, hoping that if we applied enough pressure, either you or Thornwell would break. Marcus, now in handcuffs and surrounded by additional officers who had rushed in after the gunshot, laughed bitterly. "So you used her as bait," he said, gesturing toward Catherine. "How noble of you." "We gave her the chance to do what she's clearly wanted to do for 20 years, the taller detective replied. "To tell the truth and seek justice for the lives you stole. The letter you sent to her 3 weeks ago? We made sure it was intercepted and replaced with our own version, designed to force you into revealing yourself." Catherine felt the world tilt around her as she realized the implications of what she was hearing. The letter hadn't been from Marcus at all. It had been from Scotland Yard, carefully crafted to bring her to this moment of decision, while simultaneously forcing the real Marcus to show his hand. "Your Grace," she said urgently, turning back to Bishop Thornton, who was being tended by several monks who had rushed to his aid. "I'm so sorry. This is all my fault." "Peace, sister," the bishop said, his voice strained but steady. "You came here to seek justice, not to cause harm. And it appears that justice, in its mysterious way, has been working toward this moment for quite some time. Over the following hours, as doctors tended to the bishop's wound, and Scotland Yard processed Marcus Thornwell, who turned out to be the recently appointed Lord Ashford, having inherited his title through a combination of legitimate succession and the convenient deaths of several relatives, the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. Marcus had indeed been using the People's Justice Committee as a vehicle for his own ambition, eliminating political rivals and obstacles to his advancement, while convincing his followers that they were serving a noble cause. After the 9th death, he had disbanded the committee and disappeared, re-emerging years later with a new identity and a carefully constructed backstory that had allowed him to enter Parliament himself. Several other members of the original conspiracy were arrested over the following weeks, though many had died in the intervening years or fled the country long ago. The scandal that Bishop Thornton had feared did indeed shake the nation, but it also sparked important conversations about political reform, the treatment of the poor, and the dangers of revolutionary violence masquerading as justice. As for Catherine, her fate was debated at the highest levels of government. Some called for her execution as a murderer and traitor. Others argued that her 20 years of penitence and her willingness to confess her crimes demonstrated genuine reformation. The case even reached Queen Victoria herself, who was said to have spent hours in contemplation before making her decision. In the end, Catherine was spared the death penalty, but sentenced to life imprisonment for her role in the murders. Yet even this sentence came with unusual provisions. She would be allowed to continue her work as a nurse, tending to sick prisoners in Newgate Prison. She could receive visitors and continue her religious practices, and most remarkably, she was granted the opportunity to meet privately with the families of her victims, to offer whatever explanation and apology she could for the pain her actions had caused, one by one. Over the course of several years, Catherine met with the widows and children of the 9 lords she had helped murder. Some refused to forgive her, their anger and grief too deep for reconciliation. Others, seeing the genuine remorse in her eyes and hearing the story of how a desperate, grieving young woman had been manipulated into terrible crimes, found room in their hearts for something approaching understanding, if not forgiveness. The most surprising visitor came 5 years into Catherine's sentence, when Bishop Thornton, fully recovered from his wound, arrived at the prison with a proposal that would change her life once again. "The Queen has been impressed by your conduct during your imprisonment," he explained, settling into the small visiting room with his characteristic dignity. Your work with the sick prisoners has saved numerous lives, and your willingness to face your victims' families with honesty and humility has demonstrated the sincerity of your penitence. Catherine waited, hardly daring to hope for whatever he might say next. Her Majesty has decided to commute your sentence, the bishop continued. You will be released into the custody of the church, with the understanding that you will spend the remainder of your life in service to the poor and sick. You will never be fully free. You'll live under church supervision and be prohibited from leaving England, but you will have the opportunity to continue the work of redemption you began 20 years ago. Tears streamed down Catherine's face as she absorbed the magnitude of this unexpected mercy. Why? She whispered. Why would the Queen show such grace to someone who committed such terrible crimes? Bishop Thornton smiled gently. Because she believes, as I do, that true justice is not merely about punishment, but about redemption and transformation. You cannot undo the past or bring back the lives that were lost, but you can dedicate your remaining years to saving other lives and preventing other desperate young people from making the terrible choices you made. Catherine was released 3 months later to a small hospital in London's East End, where she spent the next 30 years of her life caring for the poorest and most vulnerable members of society. She never forgot the 9 lives she had helped take, and she spoke openly about her crimes whenever asked, using her story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of revolutionary violence and the importance of seeking justice through lawful means. When she died in 1892 at the age of 75, Catherine Blackwell, who had lived as both a revolutionary conspirator and a repentant nun, was mourned by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched through her decades of service. The scandal of the 9 murdered lords had long since faded from public memory, but those who remembered understood that her true legacy was not the crimes of her youth, but the redemption she had pursued with such fierce determination in the years that followed. Her story became a reminder that even the darkest sins could be met with grace, that justice could include mercy, and that the human capacity for transformation and redemption was limitless for those with the courage to face their past and dedicate themselves to a better future. Thank you so much for following Catherine's incredible journey from darkness to redemption with us. If you've enjoyed this story, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We're so close to reaching 1,000 subscribers, and when we do, we have an absolutely amazing surprise planned for our community, something that will take your breath away. Hit that subscribe button and join our growing family of story lovers. You won't want to miss what we have in store.